In today's video, I want to introduce you to what I believe is the world's smallest full-frame anamorphic setup, the Canon R8 teamed up with this Sirui Saturn 35mm anamorphic lens. This tiny anamorphic lens pairs up so nicely with the small body of the Canon R8 to give you amazing cinematic image quality in such a small package. So let me start by showing you some footage from a few projects that I've used this setup on lately, and then afterwards we will talk about the lens and what makes it so unique. So I hope you enjoyed that short montage of footage that I've managed to get over the past few weeks using the R8 and this Sirui anamorphic lens. But let's take a look at the lens, look at the specs, and see what makes this little anamorphic lens so special. So in terms of construction, the front barrel of this Saturn 35mm anamorphic lens is constructed of carbon fiber. This is what makes this lens so lightweight, yet the rest of the lens's construction is solid metal, which makes for a really durable lens. And you can just tell by holding this lens in your hands that it is very well built and will survive some tough situations. Thanks to those carbon fiber elements, that helps keep the weight down on this Sirui anamorphic lens to a measly 420 grams, which is tiny. And if you used any other anamorphic full-frame lenses, from Sirui themselves even, you will know just how light this is, as many of the other options come in well over a kilogram. The lens isn't just lightweight, it is also very small, measuring around 4 inches in length. This makes the lens ideal for not just handheld, but for gimbal work and even something crazy like FPV drone work. This Saturn 35mm anamorphic lens has a squeeze factor of 1.6 times. So when you use this 1.6 times anamorphic lens with a typical 3x2 full frame sensor that you're going to find in most mirrorless cameras like the R8, the unsqueezed image has a very cinematic looking 2.4:1 aspect ratio. Despite this lens being labelled as a 35mm field of view, just due to the way that anamorphic lenses work, you will actually in reality get a much wider field of view. As you can see in these shots, the field of view is super wide, great for things like establishing shots or showing motion, and in terms of a full frame equivalent on a spherical lens, you get much closer to, I would say, a 22mm field of view, which is super wide. One of the key characteristics of an anamorphic lens is in the flares, of course. And this lens is no different. It gives you those classic horizontal flares that people typically associate with anamorphic lenses. So you can get this Saturn 35mm lens in 2 flare options, and I opted for the blue flare option. So those horizontal flares are going to show up on camera as blue streaks of light, as you can see here. However, Sirui also offer a natural flare version of this lens, where the flare will just take on the color of the light source itself. So if you want a more natural looking image or a warmer image, then that might be the one to go for. I really love how this Sirui handles flaring. It is actually quite subtle, and I've noticed on other models, especially in this price range when it comes to lower cost anamorphic lenses, that they can quite often overdo the flares and they can be really distracting and over the top. So this Sirui 35mm lens is fully manual, so no autofocus with the R8, so you're gonna have to pull focus manually. The Sirui 35mm anamorphic lens has a maximum aperture of t2.9, so although not the widest, that aperture I think is what allows for such a small lens. And in terms of low light, when paired with something like the R8, which is amazing at high ISOs, I think that 2.9 is more than enough. So in terms of image quality, I've found the Saturn 35mm to be a really sharp lens in the center. The R8 has some of the sharpest 25p and especially 50p on the market. So pairing it with this lens does not hold the camera back and the results are excellent. This lens gives you all of that beautiful character that you would want in an anamorphic lens. The rendering of out of focus areas look really great with that typical oval bokeh that you see in anamorphic lenses. I did find though that 2.9 aperture, along with such a wide field of view, it can be hard to get a ton of background blur, but when you do, it looks great. In general, the small body of the R8, along with how lightweight it is, made for a great combination with this tiny lightweight anamorphic lens. It was just so fun to use, whether that was handheld, on a tripod or on a gimbal. So I've got the R8 on the DJI RS3 Pro gimbal now, and this is my favourite setup to use with a gimbal. The R8 has such a small and lightweight body, and this Sirui anamorphic lens, because of its carbon fibre build, makes for just the perfect lightweight setup. It's really easy and nice to hold for long periods of time because I personally hate using gimbals. So the lighter, the better in terms of a setup, and I've just really enjoyed using this combination with this gimbal. But the beauty of this tiny camera and lens combination is that you can use some of the smaller, cheaper gimbal options on the market, such as the DJI RS3 Mini. I have used this lens with both the R6 Mark II and the Canon R5 and the results are great, but it is worth bearing in mind that Canon's IBIS does not play nice when you are shooting anamorphic. Of course, this is not a problem you're going to have with the R8, which does not have IBIS, which is why I think that lends itself to being a great companion with this little anamorphic lens. But the majority of the footage that I'm showing now was shot with absolutely no stabilisation. It was all handheld. The results are surprisingly stable, and I think the fact that this lens is so wide, that definitely helps, but there is not a ton of micro jitters, and I think that actually the footage came out pretty smooth. There is absolutely no stabilisation done in post either. Now there are a few downsides when shooting anamorphic that you need to be aware of. Some are specific to this lens, but some are just downsides of anamorphic in general, so let's get into those. The first one is the distortion. So when shooting horizons and wide landscapes, you're going to see some distortion in the frame that you will need to correct in post. But it wasn't something that bothered me too much, and is again just one of those characteristics you kind of have to accept when shooting anamorphic. Another downside with this lens, which again I think is typical of most anamorphic lenses, is that it does not have a particularly close minimum focus distance. The closest you can get with this lens is 0.9 meters, which isn't great because you can't get those close-ups of people or of objects. And when I was shooting this project, there was quite a few times where I actually needed to get close up on a phone or on a prop or something like that, and this lens wouldn't quite get me close enough. Another downside, which I think is unique to this lens, and I mentioned earlier, is that short focus throw. So this lens doesn't have a super long focus throw, which makes getting things in focus, especially when there's motion and movement in the frame, a little more difficult than it would be if it had a longer focus throw. But overall, I think those things are just small prices to pay for such a unique lens. This has been one of the most fun lenses to use for video on the Canon R system. We don't have a ton of third-party options, so I love that Sirui are bringing these anamorphic lenses to RF mount. So this lens comes in at just over $1,000, which isn't cheap, but in the world of anamorphic lenses, that is actually pretty reasonable. The lens has good image quality and great build, and it offers a really unique anamorphic shooting experience in such a small package that it really lends itself to certain niches such as car rigs, drone work, or of course gimbal work. So if you're looking for something fun and different for your video setup on the RF mount, definitely take a look at this Sirui Saturn 35mm anamorphic lens. If you haven't had a chance to shoot anamorphic yet and you want to have a play around with some footage, then there is a link in the description to some downloadable video files. There's also a link in the description to the product page for this lens, along with a discount code if you are thinking of purchasing this lens. Thanks as always for watching, and a big thank you to Sirui for sending this lens out to me to try. I hope you enjoyed the video, and please let me know your thoughts on the lens down in the comments. Thanks again, and I will see you in the next one.